The warm summer evening cast a golden glow across the backyard barbecue as laughter and conversation filled the air. Jonathan Roumie stood near the grill, chatting easily with friends and fellow cast members from The Chosen, at what was supposed to be a simple, relaxed gathering. When someone mentioned karaoke and pointed to the small stage set up in the corner, Jonathan just smiled and shook his head politely. What happened next would transform an ordinary party into an unforgettable moment that would touch hearts and challenge everyone's understanding of faith, vulnerability, and the power of authentic expression. "Come on, Jonathan, you have to sing something," called out Dallas Jenkins, the show's creator, as he approached with a mischievous grin. "We've all heard you hum on set, and everyone knows you have a great voice. This is supposed to be fun, remember?" The small crowd of about 30 people began to cheer and applaud, clearly enthusiastic about the idea of hearing the man who portrayed Jesus sing at their casual gathering. Jonathan held up his hands in protest, laughing as he tried to deflect the attention away from himself. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's simple, heartfelt expression completely changed the atmosphere in a room? What happens when an actor known for playing Jesus steps away from cameras and scripts to share something deeply personal? This is the powerful story of how Jonathan Roumie's unexpected song at a backyard party revealed the profound difference between performing faith and living it, leaving everyone present with tears in their eyes and questions in their hearts. The gathering had started as a wrap party for the latest season of The Chosen, but it had evolved into something more intimate and relaxed. Cast members, crew, and their families mingled in the warm evening air, grateful for a chance to connect as real people rather than colleagues working under the pressure of production deadlines. Children played in the yard, while adults shared stories, laughter, and the kind of easy conversation that comes when people who work closely together finally have time to simply enjoy each other's company. Jonathan had been looking forward to this evening for weeks, eager to spend time with the people who had become like family during their months of filming together. Unlike the controlled environment of the set, here he could just be himself. Not Jesus of Nazareth, not the celebrity everyone wanted to meet. Just Jonathan, friend and fellow actor, who enjoyed good food and genuine conversation. He moved through the crowd with his characteristic warmth, checking on the children, complimenting the food, and making sure everyone felt included in the festivities. The karaoke setup had been Dallas's wife's idea, a fun addition to help people relax and show off hidden talents. So far, they'd heard everything from show tunes to classic rock, with varying degrees of skill but universal enthusiasm from the supportive audience. The small stage was nothing fancy, just a raised platform with a microphone and speakers. But it had already provided plenty of entertainment and laughter as people stepped out of their comfort zones. As the evening progressed, and more people took turns at the microphone, the crowd naturally began to look toward Jonathan with expectant smiles. Everyone knew he had musical training from his theater background, and many had heard him singing quietly during breaks in filming. But Jonathan consistently declined invitations to perform, preferring to cheer others on while staying safely in the background, content to be an encouraging audience member rather than the center of attention. "I appreciate the encouragement, but I'm really just here to enjoy everyone else's performances," Jonathan said diplomatically when another friend approached with the microphone. "Besides, after hearing Maria's amazing rendition of that Broadway song, I think we should just end on a high note." His deflection was gentle but firm, accompanied by his warm smile that somehow managed to be both grateful and resolute at the same time. Elizabeth Tabish, who played Mary Magdalene on the show, joined the group that was gently pressuring Jonathan to perform. "Jonathan, we see you work every day, bringing such depth and authenticity to your role," she said with genuine affection. "We'd love to hear something that comes from you personally. Not from a script, just something real, something that matters to you." Her words carried weight because everyone knew she understood the challenges of balancing personal faith with public performance. The crowd grew quiet as they sensed a shift in the conversation, recognizing that this was about more than just entertainment or showing off vocal skills. There was something in Elizabeth's tone and Jonathan's thoughtful expression that suggested deeper currents beneath the surface of their casual party atmosphere. People moved closer, forming a loose circle around the small group, drawn by an intuition that something meaningful might be about to happen. Jonathan looked around at the faces surrounding him. People who had worked alongside him to bring ancient stories to life, who had witnessed his dedication to authenticity in every scene, who had become friends through shared purpose and mutual respect. These weren't strangers or fans seeking entertainment. They were people who knew him well enough to understand the difference between performance and genuine expression. The weight of their friendship and trust seemed to settle on his shoulders as he considered their request. "I don't really do karaoke," Jonathan said quietly, his usual confident demeanor showing a hint of vulnerability. "When I sing, it's usually something more personal, something that means something to me rather than just entertainment." He paused, looking down at his hands before meeting their eyes again. "And those psalms don't always translate well to party atmospheres. They're more like prayers than performances." Dallas stepped forward, his expression serious but encouraging. "Maybe that's exactly what this moment needs," he suggested gently. "We spend so much time thinking about how to portray faith authentically on screen. But maybe we need to hear what faith sounds like when it's just real, when it's just you." His words seemed to resonate with the group, heads nodding in agreement as people recognized the truth in what he was saying. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something internal. The party continued around them in muted tones, but their small circle had become its own intimate space, where deeper conversations were possible. Finally, he looked up with a slight smile that held both nervousness and resolve. "There is something," he admitted slowly. "Something I wrote a few years ago during a particularly difficult time in my life, but it's very personal." "Personal is exactly what we want to hear," Maria, who played Tamar in the show, said softly. "We've all shared so much through this work together, through bringing these stories to life. Maybe it's time for you to share something that's completely yours." Her words seemed to give Jonathan the permission he needed to consider seriously what they were asking of him. The evening air had grown cooler as the sun began to set, and string lights came on overhead, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Someone had turned down the background music, and conversations had naturally quieted, as people sensed that something special might be about to happen. Children who had been playing loudly were now sitting quietly with their parents, somehow understanding that the adults were having an important moment. Jonathan walked slowly toward the small stage, each step seeming to carry the weight of decision and vulnerability. "I want you all to understand," he said, turning to face the group before stepping up to the microphone. "This isn't a performance. This is something I've never shared publicly before. Something that came from a place of real struggle and real faith." His honesty created an immediate sense of intimacy, drawing everyone into the sacred space he was creating. He picked up the acoustic guitar that had been left beside the stage, testing its tuning with careful fingers. "A few years ago, before The Chosen, I went through a period where I questioned everything. My career, my faith, my purpose," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet evening air. "I felt like I was acting out faith for audiences while struggling to find it in my real life." This song came from that place of honest doubt and desperate hope. The crowd settled into complete silence, even the children seeming to understand that something important was happening. Jonathan's hands found their positions on the guitar, and he closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself before beginning. When he opened them again, there was a depth in his expression that went beyond anything they had seen from him on screen, a rawness that spoke of genuine vulnerability. "This is called When the Character Ends," Jonathan said simply, and with that introduction, he began to play a gentle, haunting melody that seemed to rise from somewhere deep within him. The guitar work was skilled but not showy, serving the song rather than showcasing technique. His voice, when it joined the melody, was rich and warm, but carried an ache that immediately drew listeners into his emotional landscape. The song began with questions rather than answers, lyrics that spoke of the confusion that comes when public faith and private struggle collide. Jonathan sang about the weight of portraying something sacred while feeling spiritually empty, about the fear that maybe he was just a good actor rather than a genuine believer. His voice cracked slightly on certain lines, not from technical failure, but from the emotional weight of what he was sharing. As the song progressed, it became clear that this wasn't just about acting or career struggles, but about the universal human experience of faith in crisis. Jonathan sang about feeling abandoned by God while still desperately wanting to believe, about the loneliness of spiritual doubt in communities that expect certainty. The melody supported these themes beautifully, minor keys and unresolved harmonies that reflected the emotional complexity of the lyrics. Around him, the audience was transfixed. Some had tears already streaming down their faces, recognizing their own struggles in Jonathan's honest words. Others sat with expressions of deep concentration, as if they were hearing their own unspoken questions finally given voice. The song was creating a space where doubt and faith could coexist, where questions were as sacred as answers. The bridge of the psalm marked a turning point, both musically and lyrically, as Jonathan's voice grew stronger and the melody began to resolve into major T's. He sang about finding God not in the grand gestures or perfect performances, but in the quiet moments of honest desperation. The lyrics spoke of discovering that faith wasn't about having all the answers, but about continuing to ask the questions even when they hurt. As Jonathan moved into the final verse, his voice took on a quality that was both triumphant and humble, conveying hard-won wisdom rather than easy victory. He sang about learning that authenticity was more valuable than perfection, that admitting doubt could actually deepen faith rather than destroy it. The song wasn't offering simple solutions, but rather a framework for living with questions while still choosing hope. When the last note faded into the evening air, the silence that followed was profound and reverent. No one seemed willing to break the spell that Jonathan's song had cast over the gathering. Tears were visible on many faces, and even those who weren't crying looked deeply moved by what they had just experienced. The party atmosphere had been transformed into something approaching a worship service, intimate and sacred. Jonathan set the guitar aside carefully, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry if that was too heavy for a party," he said with a slight, self-conscious laugh. "I warned you it was personal." But the response from the crowd made it clear that apologies were unnecessary. The depth of what he had shared had touched something real in each person present. Elizabeth was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "Jonathan, that was..." She paused, searching for words. "That was exactly what my soul needed to hear tonight. I had no idea you had written something so beautiful, so honest." Her words seemed to open the floodgates for others to express their own responses to what they had just experienced. "I've been struggling with some of the same questions," admitted Noah James, who played Andrew in the series, "especially playing a disciple, wondering if I'm worthy of representing these characters when my own faith feels so uncertain sometimes." His confession created a ripple of recognition through the group, as others nodded in understanding. "Your song made me feel less alone in that struggle." Dallas stepped forward, visibly emotional. "Jonathan, in all our conversations about authenticity in the show, I never realized you were wrestling with these questions so deeply in your own life," he said. "What you just shared was more real than anything we've ever captured on camera. It was ministry, not performance." His words carried particular weight because of his role in creating the vision for their shared work. One of the crew members, a sound engineer named Mike, who rarely spoke in group settings, surprised everyone by stepping forward. "I'm not particularly religious," he said hesitantly, "but what you just sang spoke to something in me that I can't quite name. It felt true in a way that goes beyond religious belief." His comment highlighted how Jonathan's song had transcended traditional boundaries, reaching hearts regardless of their starting point. As individuals continued sharing their responses, it became clear that Jonathan's song had created space for others to voice their own doubts, questions, and struggles with faith. The conversation that followed was unlike anything they had experienced together, marked by unusual honesty and vulnerability. People spoke about their fears, their doubts, and their hopes, with the openness that the song seemed to have made possible. "I think what you've shown us," said Paris Patel, who played Matthew, "is that doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's often the beginning of deeper faith. Your willingness to share that struggle gives the rest of us permission to be honest about our own." His observation seemed to capture something essential about what had just happened, the way Jonathan's vulnerability had created safety for others to be equally honest. As the evening progressed, the conversation naturally evolved from individual responses to broader discussions about faith, art, and authenticity. Jonathan's song had served as a catalyst for the kind of deep dialogue that rarely happens in casual social settings. People found themselves discussing questions they usually kept private, exploring ideas they normally only considered in solitude. "You know what strikes me most," said Jordan Walker Ross, who played Little James, "is how your song captured something that traditional worship music often misses: the reality of spiritual struggle. Most church songs pretend everything is resolved, but yours honored the questions while still pointing toward hope." His insights sparked further discussion about the role of art in expressing faith authentically. The party had transformed into something resembling a retreat or deep fellowship gathering, with people sitting in small circles having intense conversations about meaning, purpose, and belief. Children had fallen asleep in their parents' arms or on blankets spread on the grass, while adults continued processing what they had experienced through Jonathan's song and the discussions it had prompted. As the night grew later, several people approached Jonathan individually to thank him for his courage in sharing something so personal. Each conversation was brief but meaningful, with people expressing how his honesty had affected them. "I didn't know how much I needed to hear that," became a refrain throughout these individual exchanges, highlighting the power of one person's authenticity to meet others in their places of need. "Jonathan," said Laura Silva, who played Eden, "I wonder if you realize what a gift you've given us tonight. Not just the psalm, although that was beautiful, but the permission to be real about our struggles." She paused thoughtfully. "In our work, we're always trying to portray these perfect examples of faith, but you've shown us that authentic faith includes the wrestling, includes the questions." Dr. Doug Huffman, the show's theological consultant who had been quietly observing the evening's transformation, offered his perspective as both scholar and believer. "What you've modeled tonight, Jonathan, is something the early church understood, but modern Christianity sometimes forgets: that faith is a conversation with God, not a monologue," he said. "Your song was that conversation made audible, and it's profoundly biblical in its honesty." As the evening began to wind down, people started gathering their things and preparing to leave, but the departures were slow and reluctant. No one seemed quite ready to return to ordinary life after what they had experienced. Hugs were longer, conversations at car doors stretched on, and several people mentioned hoping to continue discussions that had begun around Jonathan's song. "I think what happened tonight was holy," Elizabeth said quietly to a small group that lingered after most others had left. "Not in a formal, religious way, but in the truest sense. We encountered something sacred through Jonathan's willingness to be completely honest about his struggle and his faith." Her words seemed to capture what many were feeling, but hadn't been able to articulate. Jonathan, helping to clean up the remnants of the party, seemed almost surprised by the impact his song had created. "I never expected that sharing my questions would resonate with so many people," he confided to Dallas as they folded chairs. "I always thought faith meant having answers, not admitting doubts." The creator's response was immediate and firm. Tonight proved that the opposite is true. As the last guest departed, leaving only the core group of closest friends, the conversation turned to what the evening meant for their ongoing work together. "I think we witnessed something tonight that needs to inform how we approach the show," Dallas said thoughtfully. "The authenticity that Jonathan showed, that willingness to wrestle with faith rather than just present it, that's what we should be aiming for in every scene." In the weeks that followed, word of Jonathan's song began to spread beyond those who had been present at the gathering. Several people shared the experience with close friends, describing how moved they had been by his honesty and the depth of his songwriting. While no one recorded the performance out of respect for the intimate setting, the memory of it continued to impact those who had been there. The experience also seemed to deepen the relationships among the cast and crew members who had witnessed Jonathan's vulnerable moment. There was a new level of trust and openness in their interactions, both on set and off, as if his willingness to share so honestly had given everyone permission to be more authentic in their relationships with each other. Jonathan found himself approached by several colleagues in the days following the party, people wanting to continue conversations that his song had started. Some shared their own struggles with faith and doubt, while others asked if he would consider sharing the song more broadly. Each conversation reinforced his growing understanding that vulnerability could be a form of ministry, that admitting questions could strengthen, rather than weaken faith. "I keep thinking about your song," Maria told him during a break in filming a few days later. "Specifically about that line where you sang about finding God in the questions rather than despite them." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "It's changing how I pray, how I approach my own doubts. Instead of seeing them as failures of faith, I'm starting to see them as invitations to go deeper." The experience also influenced Jonathan's approach to his role as Jesus in subtle but meaningful ways. Having shared his own spiritual struggles so openly, he found new depth in portraying a Jesus who wrestled with doubt in Gethsemane, who asked why God had forsaken him on the cross. The authenticity he had shown at the party began to inform his performance, making it more real and relatable. Dallas noticed the change immediately. "There's something different in your portrayal since that night," he observed during a particularly powerful scene they were filming. "You're accessing something deeper, something more human and divine at the same time." Jonathan nodded, understanding exactly what the director meant. "Sharing my doubts somehow made my faith more real, more accessible." Several weeks after the party, Jonathan received an unexpected message from Mike, the sound engineer who had been moved by the song despite his lack of religious background. "I wanted you to know that your song has been haunting me in the best way," Mike wrote. "I've started asking questions about faith that I never thought I was allowed to ask. I don't know where this journey will lead, but thank you for showing me that questions can be sacred too." The message prompted Jonathan to reflect on the ripple effects of that single evening, how one moment of vulnerability had continued to spread in ways he never could have anticipated. It reinforced his growing belief that authenticity was more powerful than perfection, that sharing struggles could be more meaningful than presenting solutions. The party had been a turning point, not just for him personally, but for his understanding of what it meant to live faith publicly. Elizabeth organized a small gathering a month later, specifically asking Jonathan if he would consider sharing his song again for a slightly larger group of friends and family members who hadn't been present at the original party. "People need to hear what you have to say," she urged gently. "Your song creates space for honest conversation about faith in a way that nothing else I've experienced does." After much consideration, Jonathan agreed, but with conditions. "It can't become about me or my music," he insisted. "If we do this, it has to be about creating space for others to share their own stories, their own questions." He was determined not to let his moment of vulnerability become a performance or a product, but rather gather a catalyst for others to find their own authentic voices. The second gathering was held in Elizabeth's backyard, with about 50 people present, cast and crew members from the show, along with their family members and close friends. The atmosphere was intentionally intimate, designed to encourage the kind of honest dialogue that had emerged from the original party. Jonathan's song was just one part of an evening focused on authentic storytelling and genuine community. When Jonathan took his place with the guitar this time, there was less nervousness and more purposefulness in his demeanor. He had come to understand his song not as a personal expression, but as a gift that could serve others, a tool for creating the kind of sacred space where real conversation about faith could happen. His introduction was brief, but clear about his intentions for the evening. The impact was just as profound the second time, But the response was different because the context had been intentionally crafted to encourage participation rather than just listening. After Jonathan's song, others began sharing their own stories of doubt, struggle, and discovery. The evening became a collective testimony to the complexity and beauty of authentic faith lived in community. One of the most moving responses came from Janet, Elizabeth's mother, who had been quietly skeptical of her daughter's involvement in religious television. "I've always thought faith was something you either had or didn't have," she said through tears. "But listening to your song and hearing these conversations, I'm realizing that maybe faith is something you do, something you practice, even when you're not sure. Especially when you're not sure." As these gatherings continued on an informal basis over the following months, they developed their own rhythm and culture. Jonathan's song remained a centerpiece, but it had become part of a larger practice of using art and story to explore questions of meaning, purpose, and faith. The group began to think of themselves as a community of seekers rather than believers, people committed to honest exploration rather than easy answers. The influence of these gatherings began to extend beyond the immediate circle of participants. People carried the experience into their churches, their families, their workplaces, modeling a different way of talking about faith that made room for questions and doubts. Several participants reported that their relationships with their own children had deepened as they began to approach faith conversations with more honesty and less pressure. "What you started with that song has become something beautiful," Dallas told Jonathan as they wrapped filming on another season of the show. "It's like you opened a door that a lot of people didn't even know they were looking for. Permission to wrestle with faith instead of just accepting it or rejecting it wholesale." The observation captured something essential about what had grown from that first vulnerable moment. Jonathan had also begun to receive messages from people completely outside their immediate circle, friends of friends who had heard about the song and the conversations it had sparked. "Is there any way I could hear this song?" became a common request, followed by invitations to share it at churches, retreats, and other gatherings focused on authentic faith exploration. After much prayer and consideration, Jonathan made the decision to record the song professionally, not for commercial release, but to have a version he could share with those who were asking. "I want to be clear that this isn't about building a music career," he explained to Dallas and Elizabeth as they discussed the project. "This is about serving people who are hungry for honest conversation about faith." The recording session was itself a moving experience, with several of the musicians involved sharing their own stories of spiritual struggle and discovery in response to the song's message. The producer, a veteran of contemporary Christian music, commented that he had never worked on a song that was so deliberately focused on questions rather than answers. "It's brave," he said simply. "And it's needed." When the recorded version became available, it spread organically through networks of people hungry for authentic expressions of faith. Unlike typical contemporary Christian music, it found audiences in unlikely places, shared in seminary classes exploring doubt and faith, played at support groups for people dealing with spiritual crisis, requested at funeral services for people who had wrestled with belief throughout their lives. The song's impact was particularly powerful among young adults who had grown up in religious environments, but found themselves questioning inherited beliefs. Finally, someone who understands that doubt isn't the enemy of faith became a common response. Many reported feeling less alone in their spiritual struggles after hearing Jonathan's honest expression of the same questions they were wrestling with. Several theological professors began using the song in their classes as an example of how art could explore complex spiritual themes more effectively than purely intellectual approaches. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who taught at Fuller Seminary, wrote to Jonathan, "Your song accomplishes something that hours of theological discussion often fails to achieve. It makes space for the mystery and struggle that is central to authentic faith." The psalm also began to influence other artists and musicians, inspiring them to create work that honored the complexity of spiritual experience rather than reducing it to simple formulas. A small movement began to emerge of what some called honest faith music. songs that made room for questions, doubts, and struggles, while still affirming the possibility of hope and meaning. Jonathan found himself invited to speak at conferences and retreats, not as a celebrity or expert, but as someone who had modeled a different way of approaching faith publicly. His message was always the same. Authenticity was more powerful than perfection. Questions could be as sacred as answers, and vulnerability could create the kind of community that people were desperately seeking. At one such gathering, a young pastor approached him with tears in his eyes. "I've been pretending to have faith figured out for my congregation, but your song gave me permission to admit my own struggles," he said. "I shared it during a sermon last month, and it opened up conversations in our church that we've never been able to have before. People are finally feeling safe to be honest about their doubts." The story began to attract attention from Christian media outlets. Though Jonathan was careful to control how it was presented, he consistently emphasized that his song wasn't a product to be consumed, but a conversation starter, a tool for creating authentic community around faith questions. Several interview requests were declined because they seemed focused on sensationalizing his vulnerability rather than understanding its purpose. One interview that Jonathan did agree to was with a magazine focused on the intersection of faith and mental health. The conversation explored how admitting spiritual doubt could actually be psychologically healthy, how the pressure to maintain perfect faith could contribute to depression and anxiety among religious people. "Pretending to have certainty you don't really feel is exhausting," Jonathan observed. "My song was about the relief of finally admitting the questions." The magazine article resonated widely, particularly with people who had experienced spiritual trauma or felt alienated from religious communities because of their doubts. Therapists began sharing the article with clients who were struggling with faith-related anxiety, and several support groups formed around the idea of exploring faith questions in safe, non-judgmental environments. As the one-year anniversary of the original backyard party approached, Elizabeth suggested organizing a larger gathering to mark the occasion and reflect on what had grown from that single evening. "It feels important to acknowledge what God has done through your willingness to be vulnerable," she told Jonathan. "Not to celebrate you, but to celebrate what authenticity can accomplish when we're brave enough to practice it." The anniversary gathering was held in a local church that had opened its doors for the event, recognizing the need for sacred space to honor what had become a movement of sorts. Over 200 people attended, including many who had been touched by Jonathan's song and its message, either directly or indirectly, through the ripple effects of that original evening. Instead of performing his song again, Jonathan chose to speak about what he had learned through the experience of sharing it. "I thought vulnerability would make me weaker," he reflected, "but it turned out to be the strongest thing I ever did. Not because it solved my questions, but because it connected me with others who were asking the same questions. That connection, that community, that's where I found God." The evening included testimonies from people whose lives had been affected by the psalm and the conversations it had sparked. A college student spoke about how it had helped her stay connected to faith during a period of doubt. A middle-aged man shared how it had given him language to talk to his teenage children about spiritual questions. A woman described how it had helped her process grief after losing her husband. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Mike, the sound engineer who had first heard the song despite his lack of religious background. He announced that he had decided to be baptized the following month, not because his questions had been answered, but because he had learned that faith could include questions, rather than requiring their absence. "Jonathan's song taught me that seeking can be its own form of believing," he said. As the anniversary gathering concluded, Jonathan felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had begun with his reluctant agreement to sing at a backyard party. What had started as a personal expression of struggle had become a catalyst for authentic community, honest dialogue, and deeper faith for countless people. The song had accomplished far more than he ever could have imagined when he first picked up that guitar. In the months that followed, Jonathan continued to receive messages from people who had been touched by his song and its message. Church leaders reported more honest conversations about faith in their congregations. Counselors shared how the song had helped clients process spiritual struggles. Musicians sent their own compositions, inspired by Jonathan's model of honest faith expression. The experience had also profoundly shaped Jonathan's own spiritual journey. Where once he had seen his doubts as weaknesses to be hidden, he now understood them as invitations to deeper faith. His prayer life had become more honest, his relationships more authentic, and his sense of purpose more clear. The song had changed him as much as it had changed those who heard it. "I think what we discovered," he reflected in a later interview, "is that people are hungry for permission to be real about their spiritual struggles. We live in a culture that demands either complete faith or complete skepticism. But most people live somewhere in between. My song created space for that in-between place, and it turns out that's where a lot of people actually live." The song's influence extended into Jonathan's work on The Chosen as well. The cast and crew had developed a deeper level of trust and authenticity in their collaboration, informed by the vulnerability Jonathan had modeled that evening. Their portrayal of biblical characters became more nuanced, more human, more relatable as they brought their own authentic struggles to their performances. Dallas often referenced that evening when discussing the show's mission with new cast members or potential investors. "We're not trying to create perfect religious television," he would explain. "We're trying to show faith as it really is, messy, questioning, struggling, but ultimately hopeful." That night when Jonathan sang his song, he showed us what that looks like in practice. As The Chosen continued to reach global audiences, some viewers began to notice a quality of authenticity in the performances that felt different from other religious media. While they might not have known about the song that had influenced the cast's approach, they could sense the honesty and vulnerability that had become part of the show's DNA. Jonathan occasionally received requests to perform the song at major Christian conferences or events, but he consistently declined opportunities that seemed focused on entertainment rather than authentic community building. "The song isn't meant to be a performance," he would explain. "It's meant to be a conversation starter, and conversations require intimate settings where people feel safe to respond honestly." Instead, he focused on smaller gatherings where the song could serve its intended purpose of creating space for authentic dialogue about faith. House churches, retreat centers, and small group studies became the primary venues where he would share the song, always with the intention of facilitating discussion rather than providing answers. One such gathering, held at a retreat center in the mountains, produced what Jonathan later described as one of the most meaningful experiences of his life. A group of seminary students, many struggling with their calling to ministry while wrestling with doubt, spent an entire weekend exploring questions of faith, authenticity, and vulnerability. Jonathan's song served as the starting point for conversations that some participants said changed their understanding of what it meant to serve God professionally. "I realized that being a pastor doesn't mean having all the answers," one student reflected at the end of the weekend. "It means being willing to walk with people through their questions." Jonathan's psalm showed me that admitting my own struggles could actually make me a better minister, not a worse one. The comment captured something essential about what the song accomplished: permission to embrace, rather than hide, the uncertainty that is part of honest faith. As word of these gatherings spread, Jonathan began to receive invitations from unexpected sources. A group of physicians asked him to speak at a conference about finding meaning in suffering. A corporate retreat focused on authentic leadership requested his presence. Parents of teenagers struggling with faith asked for guidance on creating space for honest spiritual conversations in their families. Each invitation required careful consideration, as Jonathan was determined not to let his moment of vulnerability become commodified or reduced to a simple message that could be packaged and sold. He developed criteria for accepting speaking engagements. The focus had to be on creating authentic community rather than providing entertainment. and there had to be genuine commitment to following up on the conversations that would inevitably emerge. The song's influence began to extend internationally as well, with translated versions emerging in Spanish, Portuguese, and Mandarin. In each case, local artists worked to capture not just the literal meaning of the lyrics, but the spirit of honest faith exploration that the song represented. Jonathan was moved to discover that the themes he had thought were personal actually resonated across cultural and linguistic boundaries. A particularly meaningful development came when a group of Christian musicians in Nashville began organizing what they called Honest Faith Nights, monthly gatherings where artists would share songs that explored the complexity of spiritual experience, rather than providing easy answers. Jonathan's composition had inspired a broader movement of musicians committed to creating art that honored the reality of faith as it was actually lived, rather than as it was idealized. What Jonathan started has given us permission to tell the truth in our music, explained Sarah Chen, one of the organizers of the Nashville gatherings. We don't have to pretend that faith is always easy, or that Christians never have doubts. We can write songs about the real spiritual life, not just the Sunday morning version of it. The influence extended to churches as well, with several denominations beginning to incorporate discussions of doubt and questioning into their small group curricula and pastoral training programs. Seminary professors reported increased interest in courses that explored the intersection of faith and mental health, while church leaders sought training in how to create communities where honest spiritual struggle was welcomed rather than discouraged. Jonathan was invited to address one such gathering of church leaders, where he shared not just his psalm, but the story of how it had emerged from his own spiritual crisis. I think we've created religious environments where people feel they have to choose between honesty and belonging, he observed. But what if we could create communities where honesty was the price of admission, rather than the reason for exclusion? The question sparked intense discussion among the church leaders, many of whom recognized that their own congregations might be struggling with the tension between authentic faith and social expectations. Several committed to returning to their churches with a new emphasis on creating space for questions and doubts, rather than simply providing answers and certainty. As the song's influence continued to spread, Jonathan found himself in the unexpected position of being considered a thought leader in conversations about authentic faith. Christian publications sought his perspective on everything from doubt to discipleship, while secular media outlets were interested in his insights about the intersection of entertainment and spirituality. He approached these opportunities with the same careful consideration he applied to all aspects of his newfound influence, determined not to become a spokesperson for doubt or questioning, but rather an advocate for spaces where authentic spiritual exploration could happen safely. His message remained consistent. Faith was strengthened rather than weakened by honest engagement with difficult questions, and communities that welcomed struggle often produced deeper, more resilient believers than those that demanded certainty. The 2-year anniversary of the original Backyard Party was marked by a documentary project that several participants had proposed. Rather than focusing on Jonathan specifically, the film explored how one moment of vulnerability had created ripple effects that continued to spread through communities around the world. Interviews with people whose lives had been touched by the psalm revealed the profound hunger for authentic spiritual community that existed beneath the surface of many religious environments. The documentary, titled When the Character Ends, A Story of Authentic Faith, premiered at several film festivals before being made available through streaming platforms. Critics noted its unusual approach to religious subject matter, praising its willingness to explore complexity rather than providing simple answers. More importantly for Jonathan, viewers reported that the film inspired them to seek out or create their own communities where honest faith conversations could happen. Among the most moving interviews in the documentary was one with a woman named Rachel, who had left her church after struggling with depression and feeling that her doubts made her unwelcome in the congregation. After hearing Jonathan's psalm through a friend, She had found the courage to start a support group for people dealing with faith questions during mental health crises. The group had grown into a network serving several cities. Jonathan's song didn't solve my depression or answer all my faith questions, Rachel explained in her interview. But it showed me that I didn't have to choose between being honest about my struggles and being part of a faith community. That permission to be real probably saved my life. Her testimony captured the life-changing impact that authentic spiritual community could have for people who had felt isolated by their questions. As the documentary circulated, Jonathan received an invitation that particularly intrigued him. A group of scholars studying the role of art in spiritual formation wanted to include his experience in their research. They were exploring how creative expression could facilitate religious development in ways that traditional theological education sometimes missed. His song had become a case study in the power of vulnerable artistry to create transformative community experiences. The research project led to presentations at academic conferences and eventually to a book that examined various examples of art serving as catalyst for spiritual growth and community formation. Jonathan's contribution was a chapter reflecting on the difference between performing faith and living it authentically. Observations drawn from his unique position as someone who portrayed Jesus professionally while navigating his own spiritual questions. The irony wasn't lost on me, he wrote in his chapter, that playing Jesus on screen had actually created distance from my own faith rather than deepening it. The song emerged from my need to find a way back to authentic relationship with God, but sharing it taught me that the journey back always happens in community with others who are asking similar questions. The academic attention brought with it invitations to speak at universities and seminaries, where Jonathan found eager audiences among students who were preparing for religious vocations while wrestling with their own doubts. His consistent message was that admitting uncertainty could actually strengthen rather than weaken their future ministry, as it would allow them to connect authentically with the people they would serve. At one particularly memorable seminary visit, a student asked Jonathan how he reconciled his role as Jesus with his personal spiritual struggles. "I think playing Jesus actually taught me that doubt and faith can coexist," he reflected. Jesus himself asked why God had forsaken him. If doubt was part of his experience, maybe it's supposed to be part of ours too. The goal isn't to eliminate questions, but to learn to live faithfully with them. The question sparked a semester-long seminar at the seminary, exploring the role of doubt in spiritual development, with Jonathan's song serving as required listening for students examining their own call to ministry. Several graduates later reported that the seminar had fundamentally changed their approach to pastoral care, helping them create congregational environments where questioning was welcomed rather than discouraged. Meanwhile, the influence of that original evening continued to spread through the chosen cast and crew. Several other cast members had been inspired to share their own creative expressions of faith struggle, leading to what Dallas described as a new level of authenticity in their collaborative work. The show itself began to reflect this deeper engagement with the complexity of spiritual experience. Viewers of later seasons noted a quality in the performances that felt particularly honest and relatable, especially in scenes dealing with doubt, fear, and spiritual crisis. While they might not have known about the song that had influenced the cast's approach, audiences could sense the authenticity that had become part of the show's DNA through the community of vulnerable truth-telling that had formed around Jonathan's willingness to share his struggle. The song's influence even extended to Jonathan's family relationships. His parents, who had sometimes worried about his career choices and spiritual journey, found new ways to talk about faith that included room for questions and uncertainty. "Your song helped us realize that we could be proud of your searching, not just your finding," his mother told him during a visit home. "It takes courage to keep asking the important questions." As the third anniversary of the original party approached, Jonathan reflected on how profoundly that single evening had changed his understanding of faith, community, and authentic living. What had begun as reluctant participation in a backyard karaoke session had become a ministry of sorts, though not one he had ever planned or sought. The song had taken on a life of its own, serving purposes he never could have imagined. The anniversary was marked not with a large gathering, but with a quiet dinner among the original group who had been present that first evening. As they shared stories about how the experience had continued to influence their lives and work, there was a sense of gratitude for how God had used one moment of vulnerability to create something beautiful and lasting. "I think what we learned," Elizabeth reflected, as they sat around the same backyard where it had all begun, "is that the things we're most afraid to share are often the things people most need to hear." Jonathan's courage to be vulnerable gave all of us permission to be more authentic in our own faith journeys. Her observation captured something essential about what had made that evening so transformative. As they looked back on the 3 years since that first performance, the group marveled at the unexpected ways the song had continued to serve people far beyond their immediate circle. Letters still arrived regularly from individuals and communities who had been touched by its message, each one a reminder that authentic expression of faith struggle could be a form of ministry in itself. Jonathan had learned to hold this influence lightly, understanding that his role was simply to have been willing to be honest about his own spiritual journey. The song belonged not to him, but to the community of seekers who had found in it permission to embrace their own questions and doubts as part of, rather than obstacles to, authentic faith. "I never set out to write a song that would minister to people," he told the group that anniversary evening. "I just needed to be honest about my own struggle. But I've learned that sometimes the most profound ministry happens when we stop trying to have answers and start being willing to share our questions." His words reflected the wisdom he had gained through watching his vulnerability serve others. The conversation that anniversary evening naturally turned to the future, and how the lessons learned from that first vulnerable moment could continue to influence their work and relationships. Several mentioned plans to create new opportunities for authentic spiritual community, while others talked about bringing the same spirit of honest exploration to their family relationships and church involvement. Dallas shared his vision for future seasons of The Chosen, being even more informed by the authenticity they had discovered through Jonathan's example. "We want to keep telling stories that honor the complexity of faith rather than simplifying it," he explained. "The response to our show suggests that people are hungry for portrayals of spiritual life that feel real rather than idealized." As the evening wound down and people prepared to leave, there was a sense that while this particular anniversary marked an ending of sorts, the influence of that original moment of vulnerability would continue rippling outward in ways they might never fully know. Jonathan's willingness to share his struggle had created something larger than any of them could have planned or controlled. In the weeks following the anniversary gathering, Jonathan found himself reflecting on how the song had changed not just others but himself as well. Where once he had seen his doubts as evidence of weak faith, he now understood them as invitations to deeper relationship with God. His prayer life had become more honest, his relationships more authentic, and his sense of calling more clear. The experience had also profoundly influenced his approach to his role in The Chosen. Portraying Jesus had become not just an acting challenge, but a spiritual practice, an opportunity to explore questions of faith and humanity that resonated with his own journey. The vulnerability he had shared that evening continued to inform his performance, making it more accessible and relatable to audiences worldwide. Fan mail for the show often mentioned the authenticity viewers sensed in his portrayal, particularly in scenes dealing with Jesus' own moments of struggle and questioning. While most fans didn't know about the song that had influenced his approach, they could feel the honesty he brought to those difficult moments. "Your Jesus feels real" became a common refrain in the letters he received. The song had also influenced Jonathan's understanding of what it meant to be a public figure with a platform. Rather than using his visibility to project certainty or perfection, he had learned to use it to model authentic spiritual exploration. His social media presence, interviews, and public appearances consistently emphasized the value of questions and the possibility of faith that included rather than eliminated doubt. This approach had attracted both praise and criticism from different segments of the Christian community. Some appreciated his honesty and found it refreshing, while others worried that acknowledging doubt might weaken faith rather than strengthen it. Jonathan had learned to hold both responses with grace, understanding that his calling was simply to be authentic rather than to be universally accepted. As he looked toward the future, Jonathan felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had begun with his reluctant agreement to sing at a backyard party. What had started as a personal expression of struggle had become a catalyst for authentic community, honest dialogue, and deeper faith for countless people. The song had accomplished far more than he ever could have imagined when he first picked up that guitar. The experience had taught him that vulnerability could be a form of service, that sharing struggles could be as valuable as sharing solutions, and that authentic community formed around honest questions rather than perfect answers. These lessons continued to shape not just his artistic work but his approach to relationships, spirituality, and life itself. Most importantly, the song had connected him with a global community of people who understood that faith was a journey rather than a destination, a conversation rather than a conclusion. Through letters, emails, and personal encounters, he had discovered that his willingness to admit uncertainty had given others permission to embrace their own spiritual complexity rather than hiding it. As he continued his work on The Chosen and contemplated future projects, Jonathan carried with him the knowledge that authenticity was more powerful than perfection, that questions could be as sacred as answers, and that the courage to be vulnerable could create the kind of community that people desperately needed. The song would always represent for him the moment he learned that admitting weakness could actually be a form of strength. Have you ever witnessed someone's honest vulnerability completely transform a room and touch hearts in unexpected ways? Have you experienced the relief of discovering that your deepest questions and struggles are actually shared by others walking similar paths? Jonathan Roumie's simple act of sharing his personal psalm about faith and doubt reminds us that sometimes the most profound ministry happens not when we have all the answers, but when we're brave enough to share our questions. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe in the power of authentic vulnerability to create meaningful connections and deeper faith.